Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. Today, we're going to mix things up a little bit and talk about pop culture. And what we'll be discussing today is Wandavision. Wandavision is a story about a witch and a robot having a made up family, but it's much more than that. It's in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's going to be heavy spoilers. So you are warned right now. If you haven't watched it and plan on watching it, please watch it, and then you can come back and listen to this podcast on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and most other podcast platforms. We are now on them. And especially as people are going back to work and commuting, it's better to just listen to the podcast on the audio formats. So we are on audio formats as well for those who are watching on only the visual. So with that said, major spoilers ahead. On WandaVision, the Disney Plus Marvel series that wrapped up. And Jeremy, it's good to see you, brother.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
What were your thoughts when you watched it?
I watched it in like chunks. So I watched I binge watched the first 5 episodes, then waited for the next 5 episodes, and then just kind of binged them all too. So that's how I've been going through those Marvel shows that they're doing as miniseries on Disney Plus. But so WandaVision is all about Scarlet Witch.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think I know a little bit about Scarlet Witch from the comic books I read as a kid, but something tells me you know quite a bit more than I do, because you were much more into that world than I was. So tell us a little about Scarlet Witch's background. What's Scarlet Witch all about?
So in the comic books, she's the daughter of Magneto. And there's also different variations of it. So she's one of the few characters that goes into the X-Men world and the Avengers world. So she'll play a pivotal role because Marvel just bought all the rights to X-Men from Fox. So they're going to start introducing mutants. So there was a lot of like anticipation and hope that like mutants would be introduced by the end of this. But they're going to like drag that on probably to like the next phase, not this current phase.
Her brother was Quicksilver, and I think
Right.
Quicksilver was an X-Man for a little bit, right?
Exactly. So that's where the rights for the Marvel characters get interesting, because there was a Quicksilver in the X-Men franchise and the Marvel franchise, and they're very careful. Do we call them by their first name? Do we call them by their comic book name? And the interesting about the Wanda Maximoff character is this series is the first time they call her the Scarlet Witch.
Mm-hmm.
They're just calling her by her regular name the whole time, and they never called Pietro Quicksilver.
Also, they took the they took the Quicksilver from the Fox version of the X-Men, and they merged him into the storyline for the WandaVision series here. So that was kind of a fun play on. They now have the rights, and so they're just having fun with all the characters.
Exactly, and that they were hoping that this would open the door to the multiverse with this ulterior Quicksilver, because the next big movie with Scarlet Witch and Doctor Strange is Doctor Strange in the multiverse. So they're going to play a key role. So a lot of the diehard fans were hoping that the introduction for the X-Men character from Fox that shows up in this program is a multiverse, but it was just it was a ruse.
Fluke.
It was a fluke. The guy whose name was like John Boner or something, and they literally made fun of it like intentionally.
What are Scarlet Witch's powers? If you saw the WandaVision episodes already, you know, you can follow along. We gave you the spoiler alert already, but she has what they call in the show and in the comic books chaos magic.
Yeah, or hex, and chaos magic. Yep.
So Haig, tell everybody what chaos magic and hex bending is all about.
So from my understanding of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is her magic is something where she doesn't have to cast spells or sacrifice something for something else. It's kind of like Big Bang Infinity Stones magic, where she could just spontaneously generate spells without incantations and whatnot. So that makes her unique. So she's able to warp these powers. So in the movies, it wasn't clear if the Mind Stone was connected to giving her powers, but they clarified in the show that she always had the powers, but the Mind Stone just enhanced what was already dormant. And so that's why there's a lot of things like, I have these powers, I have this potential, but I'm not sure what's going on. And she's unable to figure out what's going on with her powers because she's suffering from immense amount of grief. In the movies, she's an orphan. She loses her country. She loses her parents. She loses her brother. He dies in Age of Ultron. And again, spoilers, so you've been warned. And
If
in
you haven't seen Age of Ultron
seriously,
yet, just go
or
with the
Infinity
game.
War.
Yeah.
We were not going to watch it. If you
Yeah,
haven't watched it, you're not
yeah,
going to watch it.
yeah.
And then she loses her robot husband, Vision, which we'll talk about later.
She doesn't only lose him, she kills him, and then Thanos turns it around, reverses time, and then kills him again.
So she sees her love die at the hands of herself, and then also the guy who wipes out half the universe.
Yep.
So she's dealing with a lot, is the moral of the story. She's been through some trauma, as you would say.
And if you remember in the last Avengers movie, she meets Thanos, and she's the one that is closest to single-handedly defeating him.
Yeah.
And she tells him as she's about to defeat him, "You took everything from me," right? So
Yeah.
so the grief and the loss seem to do something to her powers to really just let them loose in a way that's like uncontrollable and really powerful.
Yeah, she goes Super Saiyan with her powers when she loses
Yeah.
a loved one. And then there's that famous meme, and he goes, "I don't even know who you are," Thanos responds.
Right.
And Thanos itself has some very biblical Greek. It means death in Greek, the biblical Greek, by the way. It's just a cool thing to be aware of.
Right. So let's also fill people in on the Vision angle, and then I think we can get into some of what's going on in the show in terms of themes of grief and loss. So Vision is in the Marvel Cinematic Universe Wanda's husband. They fall in love with each other. He's also a organic robot. So he's like
made of vibranium.
He's like artificial intelligence incarnated, and he has all these unique powers because of, it's the Mind Stone, right? It's not the Soul Stone. It's the Mind Stone.
Mind Stone.
But the two of them fall in love, and as we said, Wanda experiences the loss of Vision in the first Avengers movie, or the first half of the Infinity Wars saga. What else about Vision? What do people need to know about Vision before we get into this?
So he's just an android robot with, like, his whole thing as a character arc seems like he wants to understand humanity and who he is. So that motif continues throughout the show, and we can revisit that after we deal with grief, because there's a character arc for him, especially with the famous philosophical dilemma in the show called the Ship of Theseus. So there's this question of who am I, running through both of the characters. One coming from a superpowered perspective, who's dealing with a lot of grief, and one that's been created by humans trying to figure out who he is. So that's why these stories relate, because there's these are questions that we all are struggle with, like who am I? What does it mean to be a body or a soul or a spirit, or am I one of those? Or is it one or the other? So Vision plays that role for us, and this is a very common sci-fi motif in most science fiction, with post like scientific robot android movies, because there a lot of computers are made in our image, and theologically we're made in God's image. So what does that mean? And Vision as a character in like Age of Ultron 2 kind of plays this like perfect human being perspective. He's able to lift up Thor's hammer. He has the Mind Stone. So many people thought that he might have been the one who would defeat Thanos early on, but that was not the case, because the person who beats Thanos in the comics is a guy named Adam Warlock, who's like the Jesus Christ figure in the Marvel universe. They're going to introduce him in Guardians of the Galaxy 3, and he's the leader who beats Thanos in the comics because he's attached to the Soul Stone, not the Mind Stone. but that's probably another episode in the future.
Yeah.
Let's turn down the nerdiness a little bit and go back to talking about grief.
But before we do that, Vision is also like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he's like the embodiment of logic. Everything he does follows a specific philosophical deductive reasoning because of the Mind Stone, but also because he's created out of Tony Stark's machine, or an artificial intelligence machine. In the comic books, correct me, I don't know if I'm right. Does Tony Stark doesn't create Vision in the comic books, does he?
No, it's more convoluted. Vision is based off of the Human Torch, which is one of the early superheroes, but not the Fantastic Four superhero.
Right.
And
it gets messy. It's a rabbit trail. If we
it's a convoluted rabbit trail.
But in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he's created by Tony Stark out of his AI for his super suit.
Jarvis was his butler, who was his father figure. So the character of Vision is actually in most of the movies because Jarvis plays an important role.
Right.
So that's really cool to know that he's been there from the beginning.
Right. And he follows this very strict logic. And in WandaVision, full circle now back to where we were starting. In WandaVision, he is trying to understand what's happening inside this bubble that he's been dropped into.
Literally
in
a bubble.
He's technically, I mean, again, spoilers alert, he's dead. He's not alive. He's been disassembled, and they're probing and prodding him in a laboratory to try to understand his technology and actually revive him as a sort of mass weapon for destruction. So that's Vision. So we talked about a little bit about Wanda. We talked a little bit about Vision.
So yeah, you have this person who's unable to deal with their emotions, and they're literally causing chaos.
Yep.
Married to a robot who has no, who's trying to understand what emotion is.
Yep.
So it's a classic tale of romance right there.
Right. So if you watched WandaVision, I'd be curious. You can drop some little comments in the comment box, but I'm curious to know what people thought the overarching theme of the show was. For Haig and I, we sat down and talked about it a little bit. We were really taken by this theme of grief, loss, and really just the powerful defenses we put up when a loved one or when something loved is lost. There's a really powerful line. It's been memed a lot online, but there's a really powerful line, I think probably halfway through, if not close to the tail end of the series, where there's a flashback of older Vision and Wanda, Scarlet Witch, sitting down together having a conversation after she's just lost her brother. And Vision's trying to understand Wanda and what she's going through. And he talks about how he's never loved anybody because he's just been, created spontaneously as a machine by Tony Stark. So he doesn't know what it means to lose somebody because he's never loved something or someone. And because of his kind of logic, he comes to the conclusion at the end of the conversation. He says this line: "What is grief if not love persevering?" In other words, grief is a correlate of love. If you love somebody and you love something deeply and are attached to it in that way, when you lose it, it's an incredibly painful moment because it's that love persevering in the loss of the presence of that person or that thing. So for Haig and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I saw that as the umbrella arc of the whole show.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that was definitely the thesis of the show.
And the power of her pain is what creates in the show this literal umbrella, this literal like defense around a world that she creates in her kind of own image to defend her from the pain and loss, and to create a world where she doesn't have to face it.
Right. But in reality, she's hurting herself because she's not facing it, and she's literally hurting the local townsfolk of Westview, New Jersey. Shout out to Eastview, New Jersey. But yeah, so exactly. So she literally creates this shield and lives in this fantasy world.
Side note, is Eastview a real place in New Jersey?
Eastview is. I don't think Westview is.
Okay, funny. Um, I think that's an interesting, if you take that as the kind of theme of the whole show, the fact that she not only enslaves herself to this vision, um, but actually enslaves others to her vision, it really resonates with the idea for me, working in the mental health sort of context, that um, your grief and loss is never just yours. It spills out into relationships with other people, and it often does involve other people being a part of that grief and loss. And potentially, if you're not dealing with it, it can be a sort of trap for others to be stuck in with you.
Yeah. No, I mean, as cliche as it is, hurt people could hurt other people.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Which is why, you know, in most cases, one of the best way to treat loss and grief is to help people come to terms with that grief and loss, to help liberate other people who are caught up in the orb of it. Um, how does Wanda kind of come to deal with her grief? I mean, we talked about why she's grieving and why she's
Yeah,
experienced loss.
just like you and me, we just create this fantasy world that we live through every decade in sitcoms. You drown yourself in entertainment.
That's right. That's
Uh,
right. It was really interesting the way that they tied all the, so the first like 5 or 4 episodes is just like the illusion of this world that she's created, um through like typical sitcom tropes throughout the decades.
mhm.
So go through and name them. I think we talked about them before we were online.
Yeah, yeah.
What do we have?
So yeah, like the first set is like I Love Lucy, and um,
There's some Dick Van Dyke in there.
yeah, yeah. So
um
you have the black and
Bewitched.
white, Bewitched, Brady Bunch, Full House. Then you jump to like Malcolm in the Middle, The Office,
Yep.
Modern Family. They had multiple tropes of each decade, so they mixed and fused. Um, but there was also a lot of Twilight Zone in there too, with how they
Twilight
shot
Zone,
it,
yeah.
because it's kind of like a scary show in a lighthearted way, because you're like,
There
what's
was some
going
Family
on?
Ties in there.
Uh,
Yeah. It was interesting, and the way they connected that later on in the story was that as a child, Wanda, her brother Pietro, and her parents, when they lived in Sokovia, would sit down and they would watch sitcoms together as a family. And meanwhile, a world was crashing around them. There was like war happening right outside their window, and they would sit down to just kind of drown it out by watching sitcoms where there's always sort of a happy ending, right?
right, right,
So the world she creates is based on these childhood memories. It's a projection of those memories, and the sitcoms are kind of the way she manifests that world in a way where everything is resolved.
right,
Until she realized that you can't resolve it by a fiction.
right, exactly. And the penultimate episode is she relives these traumatic moments, and then you understand why she's a big fan of sitcoms. Um, what was there a favorite like period piece for you, like a decade, or like a what
Oh,
was your favorite?
I love the 80s piece. I love the Halloween episode because I grew up on like the Halloween specials as a kid,
Hmm.
either on Disney or on Nick, if you remember Are You Afraid of the Dark and all that stuff. So just the concept of the Halloween special, the Spooktacular, I think that was even what they called the episode.
Hmm.
That really made me happy. What about you?
Yeah, I think I'd probably say the '90s,
Yeah.
like is connected kind of. But I do like the motif of the crazy uncle character with Pietro.
Yeah,
Like it's like a play on Who's the Boss and Uncle Jesse from Full House.
that's right. That's right.
And it's also like a cool like trivia thing. Elizabeth Olsen, the actress, is the youngest sister of the Olsen twins, who was the girl from Full House. So she
From
grew
Full
up
House.
on
That's
the
right.
sitcom set of Full House when
Right.
she was a
That's
kid,
right.
and now she was playing a sitcom where they had a live audience for some of the earlier episodes, like a live laugh track sort of thing.
I love the Pietro character.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and then there's also the motif of the noisy neighbor
Right.
being the
Right.
villain. And I think like one of my favorite shows growing up was Family Matters with Steve Urkel, and like
Steve
he
Urkel.
like personifies that annoying neighbor like no one else. Um,
One of the first things I did when I moved to Chicago was I drove down to see the Steve Urkel house, because the whole thing was set and filmed in Chicago, or at least supposedly. So yeah, there was definitely some nostalgia and throwback in these episodes. Like if Disney knows how to do anything well, it's to monetize nostalgia.
monetize nostalgia and sell toys to the next generation. Like
Right,
that's pretty much their business, guys.
right. Um, the it was in the like second to last episode, I think, where the nosy neighbor ends up being the villain, Agatha Harkness. Is that how you say it?
Yeah,
Agatha Harkness. So she's somebody in the comics that's probably very different than she is in the Marvel universe. But she plays the role of, strangely, like the villain, but also the therapist.
right,
Like she's the guide to get Wanda to kind of face all of the loss, all the grief. She doesn't know why she's doing what she's doing. It's kind of subconscious for her until Agatha walks her through the grief and the loss, and then she comes to the realization that she needs to deal with it, but also set people free from it, and eventually say goodbye to Vision and the kids that she's created within this world. So,
so she has to
um,
like confront like she has to confront these memories, right?
right,
Accept them, and then through that process she finds her identity.
right, right. She remembers how to be who she is without those people in her life now, right? Um, what's interesting is that um, yeah, I don't know where to go with this really, but what's interesting is she creates the fiction with Vision in the storyline, right? And Vision is this very logical, perceptive individual.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all throughout, he is sensing something is not right. So even in her, like, right? So this is, I guess, this is where we'll go with it. Even within her, she's created this fiction because of the grief and the loss. But even in that, there's something in her that says this isn't right, right? And you'll find that, I think, with people who grieve and who are um, experiencing some of these intense symptoms at the loss of a loved one. Like the way they're coping, there is still this kind of part of them that recognizes this isn't a sustainable way to keep going.
Right, right. And what
And
are some
Vision
like
plays that role.
what would you say are some like modern forms of that, like that are not like comic book based? Like what are like some concrete ways people don't deal with grief properly?
All sorts of stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's the common ones: alcohol, some form of addiction, something that fills the space to keep you off of facing the issue. So things that blunt reality for you are often like tools that people will use in that case. People will also just do avoidance. They just won't, they won't go there. They'll block that part of their life out. Um, I think you and I have talked about something that people do, especially in times of grief and loss. We've called it a spiritual defense, or a spiritual bypassing of the problem or the grief. Um, sometimes people will just say, you know, well, whatever, it was God's will, just let it go,
Yeah, yeah,
like, and not really deal with the fact that they miss the person they love, right? And process the emotional factor that they're gone. Um, that's a very Christian way, I think, we deal with loss sometimes.
yeah, yeah,
That's not very healthy and not very helpful. Do you
yeah.
agree with that? I don't know. Talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things like one, it's for something super traumatic, you have to be careful when you go back to revisit those memories or
Mm-hmm.
go there because they're hurt. So I think it's important to just build people up a little bit before you even get there or help them in other aspects. So there's always like a delicate process there. And I've seen God help people with like the Holy Spirit being present, empowering, giving peace and strength. And then we could go to those really hurtful places and then see the redemptive on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always that fear, like on the other, like, is it going to ever get better?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's going to be like hurtful to uh, put the like use a tool to get the bullet out of you, because we have to like dig into the flesh and get that bullet out. Like the process, the procedure is hurtful, but at the other side of it, there's acceptance, there's relief. And it's really hard to counsel or help anyone who doesn't want to revisit this stuff, because it could be super hurtful, because there could be a lot of shame, because there could be a lot of guilt. Um, but there can't be help if people aren't honest and willing to go to those hurtful places.
I think what's crucial and what we're putting your finger on is that any treatment of grief involves uh, not just going and visiting those places to some degree, but also someone alongside you in that process.
Right.
So grief will often feel isolating. People, like, one of the things people will do is just leave. Will just isolate themselves from others. Um, and in doing that, it really digs the deeper hole. To address grief, like you said, it can be really re-traumatizing to sit down and go through all of those events in your life that were hurtful, or the losses of your life. And I don't recommend it for a lot of people, especially if they're not doing it with a trained professional or with a pastor, a therapist, or somebody who knows how to handle those things. Unfortunately, also, there's not very many pastors who know how to do it. So, but the point, I think, is that it's not something you do alone. It's
Right.
something you do with others, which is also a theme of the show. It's something that Wanda has to do with, surprisingly, the villain of the story, but also Vision, and also um,
Monica Rambeau's character, who's like
that's
willing to
right.
sacrifice. And um I mean, she has a great line where she says, Wanda's the cause of this, then she's the solution to this too.
That's right. That's right.
So there's these she's like the altruistic helper, right? This helping the stranger, going like literally incarnating, going into this hex when she was free of it
Right.
to save her.
And she is also uh, somebody who has experienced her own loss.
Right.
Right. So that's another aspect that I think is relevant, that there is a special empathy that comes from people who understand loss. For somebody who's been privileged enough to not experience hurt and loss, it's very painful, or it's very uncomfortable to open up about loss to somebody who hasn't experienced it like that. And so there's a community of the hurting who are often helpful to those who are in grief.
Yeah, it's turning your pain into other people's gain. And that's the beautiful thing. When people get better, they're able to show empathy and compassion and
Right.
provide tools to help people when they're stuck. And that's really the beautiful thing about being human, is we could do that to each other. And that's the best of
Right.
humanity being revealed, when there's this altruistic ability to overcome suffering together.
Right. And it's even, not to just baptize it with something biblical, but it is biblical in Paul's thought, where Paul will say that it's in our weaknesses and our suffering that we're actually able to offer up the grace of God to other people. So we get
Yeah.
to, there's a sort of, to continue the magic theme, there is a sort of alchemy to our suffering that we turn our pain and we turn the experiences of our loss into something healing for other people, because we can empathize and connect with them in their pain and loss.
Yeah, and the same thing is connecting to God, because again, going back with that hex or that shield or that wall you put up when you're hurting, it prevents you from being honest. And if we can't be honest with God, like the Holy Spirit will never enter into situations.
Yeah.
Um, that's the reality. It's a shield that gets created when we can't confront it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's through weakness where we're able to rely completely on God's strength,
Yeah.
and His grace.
Yeah.
And then through that, we won't be arrogant. It's not like, oh, look at me, look how special I am. No, I live by grace.
Yep. Yep. Well, if the overarching theme of this whole mini series of shows was grief and loss, within it there were a lot of fun little extras.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I got all nerded out about Vision 1 and his conversation with Vision 2.
Mm-hmm.
If you saw the season or if you saw the show, you'll know what I'm talking about.
White
But
vision versus green and yellow vision.
yeah, yeah. There's a conversation they have between the two of them. It's a very philosophical, logical back and forth between two machines, two robots. But they bring up an ancient paradox or an old conundrum. Was it Aristotle?
No, it's Plato, man. It goes
It's
back to Plato
Plato.
and another Greek dude. Yeah.
Goes back to the one of the originals. Um, but it's the paradox of the ship of Theseus. So, Haig, why don't you go for it?
So it's like,
Let's get metaphysical here. Set up some identity metaphysics for us.
yeah. So you have white vision, who represents the body and the new body, and then you have the old vision that represents the memories and the soul or the mind of the person. So the ship analogy is, all right, so you have this ship that's rotting, and then you keep replacing the parts of the ship. And then when does the ship become a new ship? How many parts then need to be replaced? What happens if the ship's entire infrastructure is replaced? Is it a new ship or is it the old ship? Right. Using computer analogy, it's like, all right, I have a computer, but I keep replacing each of the parts of the computer. At what point do I just have a new computer, even though I have the same frame of the computer? So there's this conundrum. How do you label things? What creates someone's identity? So we actually end up with like a Lockean answer, John Locke, like where the answer is it's the same as long as memory is preserved and enduring. So you have the old vision giving the new vision the ability to remember stuff, but it's unclear if he's able to really understand what those memories mean because that new vision didn't really live them. So
Right.
so it's interesting
It's a
what
very
makes
modern Enlightenment way of looking at the problem, right? I mean, Locke is one of the fathers of the Enlightenment, right?
mm-hmm.
So it's like, yeah, as long as the mind is a part of the other body, then the identity still remains. It's back to Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Um, so what's really important is the mind and the memory, and the body doesn't matter.
Yeah,
Or does it matter?
or it does matter because where do these memories lie? So I think for a healthy understanding, like when we see Jesus's ministry, he was very holistic in his ministry. Like he mind, body, spirit ministry. In the Armenian Apostolic Creed, Nicene Creed, we clarify in the Nicene Creed that the human individual is both and mind, body, and spirit. So it's very important to have a holistic understanding of our identities versus just focusing on the body or just focusing on the mind.
Right.
But in that synthesis of mind and body, like that's where the spirit of the person lies. So there's literally the synthesis of a new body and someone who's not really an actual body, but just the soul of a person, like synthesizing in that moment,
right,
to create the new vision,
right,
which we're going to see further down the line.
What I think I was saying was that in the modern answer to that problem, the mind is what is valued over the body.
Right.
And if you answer that ship of Theseus problem with it stays the same because the mind is still the same, then you're answering it in a way that values the mind over the body. But in the Christian tradition, the mind and body are not at odds with one another. They are one. Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, right? The ship of Theseus. When does it cease to be the ship of Theseus and just become a new ship?
Yep. I don't know.
It's like it's similar. I think there was a philosophy professor who said, if I start to lose my hair, at what point am I bald?
Yeah.
Is there a count, or at what point do I transfer from a man with hair to a man without hair?
Yeah. So the danger of just focusing it on my identity being my mind, like what happens when someone has Alzheimer's or has like a
Mhm.
brain injury?
Mhm.
Does that person stop being themselves because they can't remember?
Right, right.
Good Christian theology would say no.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
No, go full throated. You were gonna say hell no.
was gonna say hell no.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, equally the same as those with yeah, with brain injuries or anything like that. Yeah, it if the mind is prioritized over the body, then we can go pretty scary places with that.
Yeah,
Right.
and society has.
Yeah, and we've talked about the dangers of a Christianity that is focused just on the mind and not the whole self,
Hmm.
because that becomes an intellectual mind game rather than a practiced way of life.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and yeah, and the Great Enlightenments led to the great atrocities of World War I and World War II.
right.
People thinking we were going to evolve into these higher creatures because we have our intellect.
And then we just committed mass genocide and murder.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So
logical to commit genocide.
yeah, yeah,
um, yeah, that's how tricky the human mind can be. But that's why it's important to also like part of the mind, I would say, but people would have different definitions. Is if we don't deal with our emotions,
yeah,
our logic gets hijacked, and
yeah.
that's part of the grief. When we're suffering, when we're hurting, there's these emotions that are just firing in our souls, and we have to figure out, all right, why is what's happening?
Right.
Emotions are not like negative or positive; they're just like a way that we think and communicate. It's part.
Yeah.
There's a logic to emotion that we have to understand why we're feeling certain things.
Right.
And oftentimes, if it's a hurtful one, we just shove it in the corner and ignore it. But then if we do that, it's going to manifest somewhere else.
Hmm.
That always happens. So we always have to confront the emotion as well as the logic
Hmm.
in these bodied beings that we are to be healthy and to find ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a helpful way of thinking about that where your emotions are your body's communication system in a way.
Mm-hmm.
They're indicating things that are on a sub-mind level, but also waiting to be processed by the mind. So there has to be sort of communication between the two of them. Um, I have this feeling, this sense that somebody at Disney has studied the philosophy of all this stuff. Like, there's so much behind the movies that they put out and the TV shows and stuff that they're producing on Disney Plus that they have to have philosophers somewhere helping them work through this material.
Yeah,
Like the other one was this show Soul, or the movie Soul. I don't know if you saw
I
that. I mean,
haven't seen that one.
I had a big bone to pick with it because it was very uh Socratic in terms of the like the pre-incarnate souls incarnating into bodies and stuff like that. But anyways, but all that to say, like, there's gotta be
Well, it's hit or miss.
philosophers on staff there
It's
somewhere.
hit or miss. Like I was not a big fan of the new Star Wars movies because I felt like they were just focusing more on the business side of things
Yeah,
versus telling the deeper story.
yeah, yeah,
Like the initial Star Wars movies were really about a father and son relationship.
yeah.
The new Star Wars movies didn't do that. The Mandalorian, however, did a great job of reclaiming
That's right.
that.
That's right.
Um, and I think what good leadership is, you bring the right people who know what they're
Right.
talking about.
Right. Right.
Like the
Right.
Russo brothers did an amazing job. Kevin Feige is really the captain of the ship. So he's probably the brains behind that. So you always need like a leader who knows that. But every good storyteller I know or writer, they study this stuff because a good story just connects to the human condition.
And
But
all
yeah,
of these have. I mean, we just spent an hour talking about
a
a
robot and a
movie
witch.
about a witch and a robot, and it sort of unlocks this conversation around the human experience of loss and also identity, and it's powerful.
Yeah, just a minor disclaimer because I just want to get it off my chest. Please do not dabble in any witchcraft. There's like been a popularity of it. That stuff is, you're just welcoming bad things into your life if you actually participate in any of these stuff.
There
Just
you go.
I know that may be.
Good call at the end. Maybe we should include
I'm
that in
not
the beginning in
endorsing
our rough
witchcraft,
cut.
or a robot apocalypse for that matter.
Yeah,
We cannot create Skynet. Uh, which is the
yeah.
other ethical thing with when you have these machines, right, that are just logical. The logical conclusion could be like, all right, we have to wipe out humanity, like
Yeah,
Ultron.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so and the Enlightenment led to World War I, World War II.
Yeah, so I would say hit us back with feedback if you enjoyed this episode with kind of some more nerdy pop culture stuff that Haig and I are interested in. Drop us some feedback either in your Facebook email or in the Facebook comments or in an email, and we'd love to hear back from you guys. Also, tell us what you thought about WandaVision. Leave it also in the comments, and hopefully we didn't spoil it. If hopefully you caught this at the beginning, and so you had the spoiler alert ready and synced up. But it's been a pleasure talking to everybody, and it's been good to be back. I was away for a couple weeks, and so glad to be back on the pod. And everyone stay caffeinated and enjoy the warm coffee hour.
Take care, everyone.